The United States owes nearly $38 trillion. Not million, not billion, trillion. A number so large it's lost all intuitive meaning. Bigger than the combined economies of China, Japan, Germany, and India. A debt so vast that if you tried to visualize it in physical cash, the stack would stretch from Earth to the moon, and back, again and again. And yet here's the strange part. Despite this number, despite the scale, despite the fact that interest payments alone are approaching levels that would cripple any normal household or business, there is no serious plan to pay it back. No emergency tax hikes. No meaningful spending cuts. No realistic path where economic growth alone makes the problem disappear. Because it can't. The debt is no longer a political problem. It's a mathematical one. And mathematics doesn't negotiate. For decades, governments could pretend this was manageable. Kick the can forward. Roll the debt. Borrow a little more and trust that tomorrow would be richer than today. But at this scale the rules change. The numbers stop cooperating. So if the debt cannot be repaid, and if default would destroy the financial system, what's left? Here's the part most people never hear. The plan is not to pay the debt. The plan is to make it quietly disappear. Not on paper. Not in headlines. But in real terms. And they're doing it in a way that doesn't look like theft, doesn't look like a tax, and doesn't require a single vote in Congress. A strategy so subtle, so technical, that most people don't even realize it's happening while it's happening. Right now. As you're listening to this, the largest transfer of wealth in modern history is underway. Not from the rich to the poor. Not from corporations to workers. But from savers to debtors. From people who planned, delayed consumption, and trusted the system, toward the institution that controls the currency itself. And the brilliance of the strategy is this. It doesn't feel like anything. No sirens. No collapse. No dramatic reset. Just slightly higher prices. Slightly lower returns. Slightly less purchasing power each year. Losses so gradual they're blamed on everything except the policy that causes them. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not a prediction. It's a documented framework. Used before. Studied by economists. Quietly discussed in policy circles. And now, implemented again, at a scale never attempted in history. In this series I'm going to show you exactly how this works. Not slogans. Not speculation. The actual mechanics. How a debt that cannot be paid, doesn't need to be. But to understand that, we first need to confront an uncomfortable truth. There is no honest way out of this problem. And once you see why, you'll understand why the solution had to be invisible. Let's strip away politics for a moment and talk about arithmetic. Because the problem with America's debt isn't ideology. It's scale. $38 trillion doesn't behave like normal debt. At that size, small changes don't help. Symbolic reforms don't matter. Even aggressive measures barely move the needle. Take taxes. To meaningfully reduce the debt through taxation, the government would need to extract trillions of dollars every single year, on top of already record tax receipts. Not just from the wealthy. Not just from corporations. From everyone. At levels that would slow the economy, shrink consumption, and collapse the very tax base those increases depend on. You don't solve a debt problem by destroying the system that generates revenue. What about spending cuts? That sounds reasonable, until you look at where the money actually goes. Entitlements, defense, healthcare, interest on the debt itself. Cut deeply enough to matter and you're no longer talking about efficiency. You're talking about breaking promises to tens of millions of people, destabilizing institutions, and triggering political backlash that no administration survives. Spending cuts large enough to solve the problem are politically impossible. So that leaves growth. This is the solution everyone loves to believe in. The idea that innovation, productivity, and expansion will simply outpace the debt. That the economy will grow so fast the problem will shrink on its own. But here's the catch. At today's levels, even strong real growth barely keeps up with the interest on the debt, especially once rates rise. To grow out of this problem honestly, the economy would need to expand at rates not seen for generations, for decades, without interruption. No recessions. No crises. No shocks. That's not optimism. That's fantasy. So let's be clear. Taxes won't fix it. Cuts won't fix it. Growth won't fix it. And default? Default is not an option. The global financial system is built on the assumption that U.S. government debt is risk-free. Break that assumption and everything priced off it breaks too. Banks, pensions, insurance companies, sovereign reserves, global trade. Default isn't just catastrophic. It's unthinkable. Which leaves exactly one path. If the debt cannot be reduced nominally, it must be reduced realistically. Not by paying it back, but by changing what the dollars used to repay it are worth. This is where the conversation shifts, because governments don't need to eliminate the number. They only need to eliminate the burden. And the burden of debt is not measured in dollars. It's measured in purchasing power. If you owe $38 trillion, but each dollar buys less every year, the debt shrinks without a single payment being made. Quietly, legally, gradually. This is the pivot point. The moment where debt management turns into monetary engineering. And it's not new. This exact realization, this exact constraint, has confronted governments before. After wars. After crises. After periods of reckless spending followed by unavoidable reality. Every time the solution was the same. Not austerity. Not honesty. But something far more elegant. A system designed to look boring, technical, and harmless, while doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes. In the next part, we're going to name that system. And once you understand it, you'll never look at interest rates, inflation, or normal monetary policy the same way again. The strategy has a name. It's not dramatic. It doesn't sound dangerous. It doesn't trigger alarms. It's called financial repression. Two words that sound like something buried in an economics textbook. Something academic. Something boring. And that's exactly the point. Because financial repression isn't designed to scare people. It's designed so people don't notice it at all. At its core, financial repression is simple. It's the systematic use of government policy to force private capital to fund public debt at below-market rates. Think of it as a tax that never appears on a tax bill. A transfer of wealth that happens automatically, silently, and continuously. No vote required. No announcement necessary. No explanation owed. Here's how it works. When a government needs to borrow massive amounts of money, it normally has to compete for it. Investors demand higher interest rates to compensate for risk, inflation, and time. The more debt you issue, the higher the price you should have to pay. But at today's debt levels, paying market interest rates would collapse the system. Interest expenses would explode. Budgets would be consumed just servicing old obligations. So instead of paying what the market demands, the rules of the market are changed. Interest rates are pushed down, not by supply and demand but by policy. Inflation is allowed to run higher than those rates. The result is something most people never think about: negative real returns. If inflation is 4% and your bond pays 2%, you are losing 2% of purchasing power every year. Your money is shrinking, quietly, predictably, by design. But here's the key. This only works if people are forced to participate. And that's exactly what happens. Banks are required to hold government bonds to meet regulatory standards. Pension funds are guided into them under the banner of safety and fiduciary duty. Insurance companies are constrained by capital rules that make government debt the easiest, cheapest asset to hold. The system doesn't ask if these bonds make sense. It doesn't ask if the returns are adequate. It simply mandates participation. Private capital becomes captive. And once you have a captive buyer base, you don't need to offer fair terms. You can borrow cheaply, indefinitely, while inflation does the real work. This is why financial repression is so effective. It doesn't confiscate wealth outright. It erodes it, slowly enough that people adapt, gradually enough that it feels normal. Losses are spread across millions of individuals, each too small to trigger outrage on their own. You don't feel robbed. You just feel poorer. And you rarely connect that feeling to government debt policy. From the government's perspective, it's almost perfect. Debt is reduced in real terms without default. Budgets remain politically untouched. The public remains distracted by symptoms instead of causes. And best of all, it can be framed as responsible economic management. Low rates to support growth. Inflation to stimulate demand. Bond purchases to ensure market stability. Every action has a justification. Every justification sounds reasonable. But the outcome is always the same. The real value of government debt falls. And the real value of private savings falls with it. In the next part, we're going to look at how this mechanism is being applied today, at a scale far beyond anything attempted in the past, and why it's far more sophisticated than the version used decades ago. And once you see the full toolkit, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Financial repression isn't a single policy. It's a system. A coordinated set of mechanisms, all pushing in the same direction, all reinforcing each other, all designed to achieve one outcome: keep government borrowing cheap while inflation quietly erodes the real value of the debt. Let's break down the tools. First, interest rate suppression. In a normal market, interest rates rise when borrowing increases. More supply of debt means investors demand higher returns. That's how risk is priced. But this is no longer a normal market. Interest rates today are not discovered, they're managed. Central banks set expectations, signal future paths, intervene directly, and step in whenever markets threaten to push rates too high. Why? Because even a small increase in rates would be catastrophic. When you're carrying tens of trillions in debt, every percentage point matters. A 1% increase doesn't mean inconvenience, it means hundreds of billions in additional interest costs every year. Costs that have to be borrowed again, compounding the problem. So rates must stay low. Not temporarily. Structurally. Second, negative real yields. This is where inflation enters the picture. Inflation doesn't need to be extreme to be effective. It just needs to stay consistently above interest rates. 2% inflation with 1% yields. 4% inflation with 2% yields. Year after year the math does the work. Debt shrinks in real terms. Savings shrink in real terms. And because the process is gradual, it doesn't trigger panic. People complain about prices but life goes on. Third, central bank balance sheet expansion. This is often described as quantitative easing. That phrase sounds technical and neutral. But functionally, it means the same thing every time. New money is created to purchase government debt. The government issues bonds. The central bank buys them. Those bonds sit on the central bank's balance sheet. From a cash flow perspective, it's almost circular. Interest payments flow back to the issuer. Financing concerns fade. The debt doesn't disappear, but it stops behaving like a constraint. This is debt monetization, just wrapped in respectable language. Fourth, regulatory compulsion. This is the part most people never see. Banks don't buy government bonds because they love the returns. They buy them because regulations make those bonds the safest, cheapest asset to hold on paper. Capital requirements. Liquidity rules. Risk-weighting frameworks. Pension funds are nudged the same way. Insurance companies too. Money market funds. Even corporate treasuries. The result is a captive audience. Demand for government debt doesn't depend on yield. It depends on compliance. And when demand is guaranteed, pricing becomes irrelevant. Finally, managed inflation narratives. Inflation is never framed as policy. It's framed as circumstance. Supply chains. Energy prices. Labor shortages. Corporate behavior. Anything except sustained monetary expansion. This narrative layer is critical. Because as long as inflation feels accidental, people don't connect it to debt reduction. They don't see the transfer. They don't resist. Put all of this together and you get something remarkably effective. Borrowing stays cheap. Debt grows nominally but shrinks in real terms. The financial system is forced to participate. And the public absorbs the cost without realizing it's happening. This is not improvisation. This is a blueprint. And we know it works, because it's already worked before. In the next part, we're going to step back in time to the last moment when the United States faced an impossible debt burden, and quietly solved it using the exact same playbook. This is not the first time the United States has faced a debt problem that looked impossible. In fact, the last time it happened, the numbers were just as alarming. In 1945, at the end of World War II, U.S. government debt exceeded 100% of GDP. By the standards of the time, it was unprecedented. The country had borrowed everything it could to survive the war effort, and the bill had come due. The situation looked eerily familiar. Taxes were already extremely high. Military spending had peaked and was already coming down. There was no political appetite for austerity. And yet, default was unthinkable. The United States was the anchor of the global financial system. Its debt underpinned international trade, banking, and reconstruction. Failing to honor it would have shattered global confidence. So the question then was the same as it is now. If the debt cannot be paid honestly, how do you make it go away? The answer wasn't some miraculous surge in productivity. It wasn't decades of disciplined budget surpluses. What followed was later branded the post-war economic boom. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Interest rates on government bonds were capped. Banks were restricted in what they could pay depositors. Financial institutions were required to hold government securities. Inflation was allowed to run above interest rates for years at a time. Sound familiar? This was financial repression in its original form. And it worked. Over the next 25 years, the debt-to-GDP ratio collapsed. From over 100% to roughly 30%. Not because the government aggressively paid down what it owed, but because inflation and controlled rates quietly did the work. The real burden of the debt didn't disappear. It was transferred. From the government's balance sheet to the purchasing power of private savings. People still received their interest payments. Their bonds were still safe. Their accounts still showed positive numbers. But those numbers bought less every year. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't chaotic. It was coordinated policy. And it remained politically invisible because it never looked like a decision. It looked like stability, like reconstruction, like progress. The lesson from that period is critical. When debt reaches levels that cannot be resolved openly, governments don't choose honesty. They choose time. They stretch the adjustment across decades. They distribute the losses thinly enough that no single group revolts. And they rely on complexity to shield the process from scrutiny. That's exactly why this history matters. Because the conditions today are not just similar. They're larger, more global, and far more sophisticated. In the next part, we're going to bring this back to the present, and look at who is actually paying the price right now, whether they realize it or not. The most effective part of this system is not economic. It's psychological. Because the people absorbing the cost don't feel like they're being taxed. They don't receive a bill. They don't see a line item. There's no moment where someone knocks on the door and says, "This is what you owe." The losses arrive quietly. And they arrive unevenly. Start with savers. People who did everything right. They delayed consumption. They avoided excessive debt. They trusted that saving today would protect them tomorrow. They parked their money in safe instruments, cash, savings accounts, government bonds. On paper, nothing looks wrong. The balances are still there. Interest is still being paid. The system appears to be working. But year after year, those balances buy less. A bond yielding 2% in a 4% inflation environment is not preserving wealth. It's bleeding it, slowly enough that it feels tolerable but consistently enough that the damage compounds. Over 10 years, a seemingly small negative real return quietly destroys a significant portion of purchasing power. Then there are retirees. This group is hit hardest because time is no longer on their side. They can't wait for long-term adjustments. They live off fixed incomes, conservative portfolios, and promises made decades earlier under very different monetary conditions. Their savings don't vanish. They decay. Every grocery bill is a little higher. Every utility payment takes a slightly larger share of income. The math never feels dramatic, but it never stops either. And crucially, they don't blame the system. They blame prices. They blame companies. They blame circumstance. Now look at the other side. Debtors. Households with fixed-rate mortgages. Governments. Large institutions that borrowed heavily when money was cheap. Inflation is a gift to them. Their payments are fixed in nominal terms, while incomes and prices rise. What once felt burdensome slowly becomes manageable. A loan that once consumed a third of income quietly shrinks into the background. This is the defining asymmetry of the system. Savers lose silently. Debtors win gradually. And at the top of the pyramid sits the largest debtor of all. The government. Every year inflation runs above interest rates, the real value of its obligations declines. Not by policy announcement, but by arithmetic. Trillions in debt become easier to service, not because they were repaid, but because the currency used to repay them is worth less. This is why the system persists. Because the pain is fragmented. No single group feels enough loss to mobilize. No single event triggers outrage. Everyone experiences the decline individually, incrementally, and with plausible deniability. And because there's always a narrative ready. Prices rose because of supply chains. Savings fell because rates are naturally low. Retirement feels harder because times are changing. Never because debt is being liquidated through your purchasing power. In the next part, we're going to explore why this system is so difficult to see, why it survives public scrutiny, and why it's politically safer than any alternative, no matter how damaging it is in the long run. For a system this powerful to work, it has to do one thing above all else. It has to remain invisible. Not hidden behind secrecy, but hidden behind complexity. Financial repression doesn't survive because people are stupid. It survives because the human mind is bad at detecting slow, distributed losses. A tax increase is obvious. A spending cut is obvious. A default is impossible to ignore. But inflation? Inflation feels like weather. Something that just happens. When prices rise, people don't ask what changed in monetary conditions years earlier. They look for immediate causes. The story always sounds reasonable. Shortages, energy, logistics, geopolitics, corporate behavior. And that's exactly why inflation is the perfect tool. It doesn't feel like policy. It feels like circumstance. Another reason the system stays intact is diffusion. No one loses everything at once. Losses are spread across millions of balance sheets, millions of households, millions of quiet adjustments. Each individual loss is small enough to tolerate. Together they are enormous. This fragmentation prevents coordination. There is no single moment to rebel. No single law to repeal. No obvious villain to confront. And then there's the language. Central banks don't talk about debt liquidation. They talk about price stability, maximum employment, and market functioning. Governments don't talk about eroding savings. They talk about growth, resilience, and recovery. Every action has a technical explanation. Every outcome has an alternative narrative. This creates plausible deniability, not just politically but psychologically. Even people who sense something is wrong struggle to articulate it. The system is too abstract, too indirect, too gradual. And by the time the effect becomes undeniable, the transfer has already happened. This is why financial repression is so attractive to governments facing impossible debts. It avoids confrontation. It avoids legislation. It avoids accountability. It turns time into an ally. And once it's in motion, it's very hard to stop, because stopping it would mean acknowledging what it was doing all along. In the final part, we're going to pull everything together. What this means going forward. Why this isn't about collapse, but control. And why recognizing the pattern early is the only real advantage anyone has left. Put all the pieces together and the picture becomes clear. This isn't chaos. It isn't incompetence. And it isn't an accident. What you're watching is a controlled process. A methodical reduction of an unpayable debt, not by repayment, not by default, but by redefining what repayment means. The number stays on the books. The obligation remains intact. But the burden is quietly transferred away from the issuer of the currency, to everyone who holds it. Every year inflation runs just a little higher than interest rates. Every year savings lose a little purchasing power. Every year the debt becomes easier to carry, not because it shrank but because money did. This is not a temporary phase. It's not a policy mistake that will be reversed once conditions normalize. It is the normalization. The uncomfortable truth is this: there is no alternative path left that doesn't involve pain. The only question is how that pain is distributed, and whether it arrives suddenly and visibly, or slowly and invisibly. Financial repression chooses the second option. It spreads the cost across time, across populations, across narratives. It avoids panic by avoiding clarity. And it works best when people argue about symptoms instead of structures. When inflation is blamed on everything except monetary expansion. When falling purchasing power is treated as bad luck rather than bad math. This is why the process feels so hard to pin down. Because nothing breaks all at once. Nothing officially fails. Nothing dramatic announces itself. Life just gets more expensive. Saving feels less rewarding. Planning feels harder. And most people assume that's just the way the world is now. But it isn't. It's the result of a specific response to a specific problem. Debt that can't be paid honestly. History shows us where this leads. Not to collapse, but to quiet resolution. The debt doesn't disappear. It's liquidated through time, inflation, and negative real returns. And by the time the balance sheet looks healthy again, the cost has already been absorbed. By savers. By retirees. By anyone who trusted nominal stability in a system that no longer offers it. Understanding this doesn't cause the system to stop, but it does change how you see it. And more importantly, it changes how you move within it. Because the biggest disadvantage most people face isn't inflation. It's not low interest rates. It's not knowing the game they're in. That's what this channel is about. If you want to keep digging into the hidden mechanics of money, debt, and power, if you want to understand the forces that shape the financial world beneath the headlines, then this is exactly what we do here. This is Finance Archives. And if you don't want to be the last person to realize what just happened, make sure you're subscribed. Because the transfer isn't over. And the math never stops.